Welcome back to Aether Hour, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin and a returning guest, somebody who I'm sure needs no introduction to the majority of this audience, but we will let him introduce himself in a second anyway. Of course, we're talking about Anthony of Westgate, our fellow Substacker, I believe the most regular Aether Hour guest in the history of World War Now, so it's good to be joined by him again. We're going to be discussing his recent articles on the Kabbalistic influence and roots of Protestantism, the Protestant Reformation, and just in general, a lot of the modern post-Orthodox Christianity that we encounter today, talking even about the roots of Zionism and, the theological underpinnings of what we currently now know as, the state of Israel, and how so many Westerners were able to get behind such a satanic project. We're going to be discussing that and, of course, all sorts of theological and symbolic underpinnings on this very interesting question, as well as, how we should respond as at least 2 out of 3 of us on this show were formerly Protestants. So we're going to be exploring what this means for us as Americans and people in the West and how we should grapple with this. But before Anthony introduces himself, Dmitry, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Conrad. Yeah, it's amazing to be here, and I'm very excited to speak about this particular subject with Anthony.
No, I'm glad you're here as well, and I'll let him take over. Anthony, if anybody happens to be listening and may not know who you are, feel free to introduce yourself. Obviously, the articles that we reference on his Substack are going to be linked down in the description below, so don't hesitate to check those out. Anthony, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, brothers. Once again, it's a pleasure to be a guest here on the Aether Hour. Yeah, I'm Anthony of Westgate, and I also want to thank you guys for being so kind to have me on so many times, because I have just recently entered the top 10 Rising history Substacks since they released that Rising feature, I guess. But I give a large gratitude to you guys for helping get the word out about my work. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. But yeah, so I've been writing on Substack for 3 years now. I cover esoteric history, kind of a lot of the darker forces of the modern world, and just trying to frame them in an Orthodox context to better understand how to avoid their influence and how to navigate the modern world that we live in. So that's kind of what led me to this research here. But, I consider myself primarily a researcher, and I write because that's how you present research. So I've just kind of stumbled into writing, I suppose. But basically, I came across this topic from, I would guess that there was an interest there in my background formerly as a Protestant and some of the experiences that I've had being raised in charismatic expressions of Protestantism. So there was always that kind of mystical element to it that led to my fascination and interest in Father Seraphim Rose's work, which we all know in Orthodoxy of the Religion of the Future. He uncovers a lot of the charismatic cult and the occult influence surrounding that. But yeah, so that's kind of what led me down this path. And it's been something I've been researching for a good 2 years now. And it is incredibly difficult to write about and present, because as I was beginning to put things together and write about it, I found that was just the start. The further I went into this, the more rabbit holes I discovered. And so the primary challenge with it was basically presenting it in a way that is understandable and that has a more direct focus, which in this case was on how Protestantism contributed to the transmission of the esoteric tradition in the West.
No, that's very interesting, Anthony. And, many times when Roman Catholics or, Orthodox Christians or non-Protestants, when they look at the Protestant Reformation, for example, and the traditions that come from therein, for example, the charismatic movement, which you mentioned, the speaking in tongues, or even the various evangelical cults, or even paramasonic cults. And I would say these are maybe fringe branches of the Protestant movements, for example, Jehovah's Witnesses, or even the Mormons. So these are big, almost mutations, right, of essentially the Protestant Reformation, which without the Reformation itself would never have come into being in existence. We we do kind of ascribe their mysticism to simply a misinterpretation of the Old Testament or New Testament or even church tradition, essentially, within the Christian paradigm. But what many people don't realize, and what I think your article really opens people's eyes to, is the fact that, well, there's actually a foreign influence coming into the picture and actually influencing and driving the Protestant view of, what a connection to God may be and how exactly you can reach that. Essentially, what kind of esoteric knowledge can be obtained through simply human intelligence and attempting to grasp at the mystical in life. And for example, things that perhaps in the past by Roman Catholics and Orthodox Christians would have been called magic, witchcraft, or even a contemplation, a clairvoyance, seeking of the clairvoyant and auguring, that would have been completely taboo. Suddenly, for the Protestants who deny the authority of course, an official church structure, this becomes an open book. And what comes out of that book is, of course, not just the paganistic Hermeticism, for example, Neoplatonism, but Kabbalah, which, of course, is a derivative of a very post-Talmudic tradition within Judaism. And you cover this in much detail in the article. And this is, I think, a very interesting subject because, frankly, many people would perhaps even mention the fact that Kabbalah and the Jewish tradition, the Jewish merging of essentially the post-Second Temple Talmudic way of doing things with a mystical Gnosticism, esotericism, hermeticism, it simply has something to do with the Renaissance. But what they don't realize is that this is simply the first step. The Protestantism acquiring this particular spirit of the Antichrist, this Kabbalistic teaching, is really the end result of the Roman Catholics maybe unfortunately opening the gateway, right? Allowing this to even be spoken about and written about within their own respective lands. And this disease literally transfers to mostly Germanic people, the Central Europeans, who unfortunately fall into the trap of these esoteric traditions, Rosicrucianism, etc. So maybe you can touch on that particular tradition. Like, what is Rosicrucianism? Because it is essentially the proto-Freemasonry. We hear about it all the time. It's the rose and the cross, right? Essentially what that name means. And how did Rosicrucianism inspire the first Protestant, Martin Luther in particular?
Yeah, that's something I think a lot of people are familiar with, the Rosicrucians, but it's something that's kind of mentioned in passing as you read some of this history. But, essentially, the Rosicrucians, I want to preference when we talk about some of these secret societies and even the Reformation, in that there's kind of this formal establishment that usually comes with a dissemination of manifestos or some kind of signing of a constitution. So like for Freemasonry, for example, many people think Freemasonry started in 1717 when the Constitution of Freemasonry was signed. And it's like kind of, that's when there was just simply a more formal establishment and a recognition of the Masonic network. It's like hard to pinpoint like where exactly it started because they all kind of emerged from all these other preceding secret societies. And so with Rosicrucianism, it's kind of the same thing. It's like you can say that, it was established at some point in the late 16th century after Martin Luther had died. And so you'll see a lot of Lutherans will argue that Martin Luther could not have derived his the rose and cross, that's the symbol of the Lutheran Church. Mm-hmm. He could not have derived that from the Rosicrucians because the Rosicrucians came after he died. And it's like, not really though. Like it's not like this symbology just emerged out of a vacuum. So for the rose and cross in particular, this actually came from the Templars. And so there was like some Judaic influence with the Templars that they transmitted through the Rosicrucians kind of just emerged from the Templars. I'm kind of oversimplifying things here, but this is a long transmission of history. But so the Rosicrucians, the more formal establishment, was inspired by Francis Bacon, who wrote this utopian novel, New Atlantis. And in New Atlantis, it kind of envisions what he calls Solomon's house, which is like a prototype of the invisible college. And so this was this Christian hegemony, basically, that he envisioned. And it was a networked group of secret societies that had, there were Christian Protestant rulers who had this advanced scientific knowledge. There's a techno-utopian aspect to it where you have all of these flying machines and they're going underwater. And you can even see this in some of the imagery, some of the old imagery, these woodcut carvings of illustrating the New Atlantis. This was also Bacon's vision for America, by the way. He said this to Parliament. He expressed this idea that he had this vision of America being like a new Atlantis. And oddly enough, it was established on the Masonic network. So Rosicrucianism, to answer your question, it's kind of like this transitionary phase of modern secret societies and revolutions. A lot of them emerged from Rosicrucians. I cover this in my article in the first one, how Luther was directly inspired by Stoppens, who was the master of this Rosicrucian lodge in Nuremberg. And this is where, he apparently derived a lot of these ideas from. This is the famous quote that he wrote in his commentary on Galatians, I believe. And this was in Latin. He attributes this new doctrine of sola fide to what he calls true Kabbalah. So, you have to ask, why, how did he know about Kabbalah and what is he talking about? There's references to him drawing parallels between alchemy and the resurrection. He says that alchemy is a science that I very much like. This is all cited in the article, but in particular, the quote about true Kabbalah, it's interesting that was left out of the English translation. So I had to actually go and translate that from Latin, but it's there in the original Latin in his book. It's just the English translators did not include it.
Wow, the Protestants in many ways, it's a much more surface level understanding, and you start to dig deeper into their own tradition that even they don't understand, and a lot of people don't really like that. But before we sort of, I guess, explore where the Reformation takes us on this road and how we sort of got to where we are now even with Zionism and some of these other things, I guess, obviously the Reformation itself at least claims to be, as we just said, a breakaway from, Roman Catholicism, which we know, especially at the time of the Renaissance, was importing heavy amounts of Neoplatonism, even kind of pagan, pre-Christian ideas. I mean, you look at something like the Sistine Chapel ceiling, Michelangelo openly admits, yes, there's the Christian reading of it, but there's also the slightly more esoteric, Neoplatonic reading of, much of his art. So you already mentioned the sort of Knights Templar and the Rosicrucian connection there. Obviously, many Roman Catholics might see some of the stuff, be like, oh, see, the Protestants were Judaizers rejecting the true church. But what was the state of Judaizing within the Roman Catholic Church at the time? Because many people recognize that even Luther himself actually didn't want to immediately leave the Roman Catholic Church. He was trying to reform it from within. So what was the sort of, again, you said the Knights Templar, but what was the sort of milieu of Kabbalism and Neoplatonism that the Reformation ultimately came out of as well?
Yeah, well, so this is a whole other kind of avenue that this goes down, which I admittedly didn't get too into for the purposes of this work, and I plan to. I know that Michael Hoffman has a nearly 1,000-page book on the occult influence of the Church of Rome. I think it's called something like that. So it was definitely there. And when you look at some of the early figures, the early, I guess, pioneers of Christian Kabbalah, Johannes Reuchlin, for example, was a Catholic. There was a pope, I believe it was Pope, I'm blanking on which pope it was. Whoever was the pope during prior to the one during the Reformation, I believe, he had some sympathies towards Hermeticism and Kabbalah. And so there's actually a fresco to this day in the Vatican that depicts Hermes Trismegistus. So there was definitely an infiltration of this stuff in Rome. I just have not done the work on the extent of that influence. But to Dimitri's point, you're absolutely correct that this kind of all derives from this humanism, essentially. And this is something that St. Justin Popovich makes a distinction on, and Father Seraphim Rose too, on how this is all kind of from the same form of humanism as the Roman Catholics. So St. Justin Popovich refers to Roman Catholicism as like this humanistic minimalism, because they had they at least were able to temper it with having the ecclesiastical authority in place. And the Protestants were practicing this form of like a humanistic maximalism. And so they just applied the same humanism to the individual level and, turn the individual into their own pope and into their own authority. But yeah, so you see this, you could argue that, at the onset of it, there was all these figures were kind of like John Dee, like the earlier figures, Boehm, I believe as well, they were excommunicated Catholics. So the more extreme expressions of this mysticism and this practice of magic, those guys, they got excommunicated and just became, I guess, Protestant, if you want to call it that, by default. But the primary figure, you have Pico della Mirandola. These were, the kind of the godfathers of Christian Kabbalism, who Pico was considered more of like a proto-Protestant. I believe it was the same thing. He was excommunicated, so he just became this kind of proto-Protestant figure. And then Reuchlin, who remained faithful to the Catholic Church and even had the ear of the Pope. So, predating all of this, you had at the onset of the invention of the printing press, it started with an information war right off the bat. You had this kind of war between Reuchlin and Johannes Pfefferkorn, who was a converso and was like hell-bent on exploiting all of the demonic stuff in the Talmud, all the blasphemous excerpts of their description of Christ and the Theotokos. And so he was a proponent of book burning. And so he was like, not only should we not print all this Talmudic Jewish literature, we should destroy it. It shouldn't even be in the hands of the Jews. And so there was these confiscations of all these Jewish books, and this started this war. I mean, this was what basically split Europe in half prior even to the Reformation. Like the whole intellectual world was torn over this issue. So that again was at the onset of the invention of the printing press. There was an immediate information war over the dissemination of Jewish literature.
That's very interesting, because naturally such questions about the spreading of Talmudic Jewish literature was already answered in certain places. For example, even pre-printing press in the Byzantine Empire, for example, the Eastern Roman Empire, certain books were outright banned. The freedom of speech wasn't really, and again, freedom of speech, we see it as a humanistic New Age Enlightenment sort of value, but perhaps this is where the roots of that began to essentially coalesce, you can almost say. And of course, that led to other profane things, for example, legalization of pornography and other obscenities through that prism of, well, let's just legalize free speech. But legalizing something like the printing of a Talmud or some sort of Kabbalistic texts from the Talmudic Jewish community would essentially be almost in a weird way like mystical pornography, you can almost say. And yes, printing these sort of things would again be completely condemned in a traditional Orthodox Christian society, but perhaps in places like Central Europe, Western Europe, it was seen as perhaps somewhat acceptable, unfortunately. And this is most likely why, Anthony, we do see a spreading of these somewhat dormant ideas. And you mentioned this in much detail, of course, the iconoclasm of John Calvin, of course, the sort of spiritual successor of Martin Luther and a contemporary of his, essentially the second largest Protestant leader at the time in the 16th century. He essentially reintroduced, him and his compatriots, they reintroduced iconoclasm, which was already a stillborn and dead heresy from the 9th century, which frankly, it's still a mystery, historically speaking, amongst Roman and Byzantine and even church history historians. They don't really know where iconoclasm came from or what was the inspiration. Some of the hypotheses were perhaps that Islam inspired it, because Islam is inherently iconoclastic. However, there is a particular angle where, of course, perhaps the rise of the Khazarian Empire in the north, which now occupies, which occupied the now Ukrainian lands, and its conversion to Judaism through its Kagan Bolan, perhaps that also maybe influenced certain elites and aristocrats within the Byzantine Empire, including certain clergymen, to promote this idea of iconoclasm, which eventually reached Emperor Leo III, and he of course officiated this heresy. And who whispered into Leo III's ear is the big question. Was there a certain character behind the scenes we simply don't have a recording of? That's, I think, the really interesting subject matter. But at the same time, in the Protestant scenario, we clearly see that Kabbalistic influence, of course, Rosicrucians, all kinds of alchemical inspiration was already there. It was already present. And so, of course, thinking about perhaps the misappropriation of graven images, reformation of worship itself, veneration, how appropriate is it, is already a fertile ground for such ideas to coalesce and to come into existence. So maybe you can touch on, is there any Kabbalistic inspiration potentially on Protestant iconoclasm? Because frankly, this is one of the things which makes essentially Protestantism somewhat unpalatable, especially to traditional Roman Catholics and Orthodox Christians. They simply find it insane that icons is simply not venerated and they're seen as idols, because it's like almost like a break between two worlds.
I couldn't find like a direct connection with like a direct influence from Kabbalah when it comes to the iconoclasm that you see in the Proto-Reformation revolutions, such as the Hussites, for example. They were iconoclasts. But I do see it as a form of Judaizing. And I think that there's a much stronger case for it deriving from Jewish influence, rabbinical, kind of like this rabbinical influence that they picked up from consulting rabbis to understand the Old Testament, which you see in the Christian Hebraists. And that's what a lot of the proto-Reformation movements, like the Moravians and the Hussites, these guys were mostly Judaizing through Christian Hebraism, which was more of like, I mean, we can get into this a little bit, but there's kind of a distinction between the two, where you have the Christian Kabbalists they were interpreting the Kabbalah or the Old Testament through the lens of Kabbalah. And this was a Renaissance notion of Prisca Theologia, which is that it's like a presupposition that the oldest and most ancient theology is the truest. And so they were kind of looking back in time to understand better the Old Testament. And then you had the Christian Hebraists, who were also seeking out rabbis, but not necessarily drawing directly from Kabbalah or Jewish mysticism, but more so in an effort to proselytize the Jews, to make Christianity more palatable for Jews. And so this is where a lot of the messianic cults and millennialian cults came from. But that's later on, it did start to intertwine with Kabbalism. But as far as the iconoclasm goes, I kind of just illustrate that as being a result of the Judaizing. So one of my primary sources was from Louis Newman, who is a rabbinical Jewish historian. He's a Jewish historian and rabbi, very prominent Jewish historian. And he's got this big book called Judaism and Reform Movements, something like that. And not the exact title, but he goes into some interesting detail on the iconoclasm, particularly of Zwingli and the Hussites as well. But he notes that Zwingli himself said that the Jews do not carry images, neither do the Zwinglians or Calvinists. So this is where you start to see a pretty, I think, central doctrine of Christianity start to fragment. And there's not even a common consensus among the three primary reform movements. So like the Lutherans weren't iconoclastic. And then you had the Zwinglians, who were aggressively iconoclastic to the point where you had this iconoclastic fury, as it was called, where they were ransacking churches and monasteries and physically destroying not only icons, but even the cross itself. And this comes from both Calvin and Zwingli saw the cross of Christ, the image of it, as a form of idolatry. Wow. Which is, this is what the modern Protestants say. I mean, this is kind of where it comes from. It's always been there. And so, to Luther's credit, he would criticize the other reformers of Judaizing to that extent. So, I see it as more of more of the early Jewish influence from consulting rabbis than I do a direct correlation to Kabbalah. But I wanted to include that in my article because I think it illustrates the destruction, both spiritual and material destruction, that the Reformation did in its first 200 years, leading up to literally 200 years, from 1517 to 1717, when the New World Order is established in the first Masonic Lodge and the Constitution of Freemasonry. So you have the first 200 years of this iconoclasm, and both in the iconoclastic revolts and in the spiritual destruction of the old order. And then 1717, it establishes this new, here's the new religion, here's the new kind of humanistic spirit that will be disseminated through the establishment of this Masonic network throughout Europe.
No, that's exactly, we've said it on the show a million times. Masonry is fundamentally Judaism for the Gentiles. That's sort of the purpose of it. It's to sort of, I've always viewed it as a ceremonial kind of temptation to get Christian Gentiles, separated from the church, from Christ, into their own para-religion, sometimes even without them knowing, them thinking it's still compatible with the faith. But you talk in the article a lot about alchemy and even how sola scriptura is this sort of alchemical thing. And if people think about the dates and when the Protestant Reformation occurred, of course, we're talking, in the 15th and 16th centuries when this stuff really started to develop. But right before that, in the 14th century, that's when we know, Nicholas Flamel, for example, was born. And then into the 1400s, he passed away. But his influence, of course, had a strong effect on people like John Dee and all of these other sort of magician, alchemist people that emerged around the same time as this Protestant Reformation. So it's clear that this was what was in the air at the time. And obviously Nicholas Flamel, anybody that's read Harry Potter, they know about, changing lead into gold and, the original goals of alchemy and whatnot. But I guess not only at this time was this happening, but comparing this to other breaks from orthodoxy in the past, of course, with papalism, in many ways, you can go all the way back to the crowning of Charlemagne as the Western Roman emperor and the creation of this sort of new heretical empire away from the Roman Empire that was still, of course, centered in Constantinople. And then, of course, with the big sort of civic victory of the Protestant Reformation, besides, of course, the Treaty of Westphalia, was Henry VIII's creation of the Church of England. And of course, then the English monarch became the head of the Church of England. And we know John Dee was an advisor to Elizabeth I. We even have linked John Dee to potentially to the death of Tsar Ivan the Terrible, Grozny in Russia. People can listen to our Ivan the Terrible episode to hear us pontificate a little bit on that. But I guess looking at this alchemically, Anthony, who was John Dee? What was, how was he kind of tied up in all of this? And how was he carrying on sort of this alchemical legacy that ultimately manifested itself in one of its most prominent forms in Protestantism?
Yeah, so John Dee, this is another instance of how all of these, almost everything I encountered could be its own book. And in many cases they are multiple books, volumes. And John Dee is one of those figures. He's a very interesting figure who was essentially kind of erased from history until recently. And I'll refer to Frances Yates on this because Frances Yates frames this in a way that she says that John Dee and Francis Bacon are the two figures that kind of run parallel and then kind of intersect in the establishment of these secret societies in their vision of the modern world, of this new world, and the mystical vision and how it's going to be implemented. And so these guys both kind of laid the foundation of the modern world. And John Dee's involvement was that he kind of established this Kabbalistic blueprint in how to, he was the advisor of Elizabeth I So he was a powerful figure that had the ear of the queen, in talks with all of these powerful figures. So he had some sway geopolitically, and kind of conceived of this idea of a global Protestant hegemony. And so that was the kind of like plan that he laid out. And much of the transmission of Western esotericism is derived from him. And you see his name resurfacing very often, even centuries later, and many of these figures who considered themselves followers of Dee's work, because he was kind of considered a Protestant. I'm going to refer back to what I was saying earlier, by means of being excommunicated. So he lived this life of exile from the Catholic Church and amassed this huge library. I think it was the second largest library in Europe in this 16th century, which he acquired most of the books from the monasteries and Catholic churches that were ransacked by the Protestants. So, he just had this huge library, and this guy had some very bizarre occult practices where he would gaze into crystals and communicate with angels quote angels. They were, we know that they were demons. And one of the angels that he derived his Enochian magic system from was named Uriel. So he was communicating with these quote angels, and his companion, Edward Kelly, who was allegedly a necromancer, he recorded all these conversations that Dee had with these demons. And it got to the point where, and this is how you know they were demons, the angels, I'm kind of using these terms interchangeably, angels and demons, but they started to essentially control John Dee and give him these commands. And so one of the famous incidents was that towards the end of his life, this Uriel figure told John Dee that he needed to wife swap with Edward Kelly. And Edward Kelly's wife was kind of repulsed by John Dee. So this basically nobody was on board with this idea, but he was ultimately kind of beholden to he's enslaved by these demons. And so he went through with it, and, they were never the same again. It just kind of ruined both of them and their wives. So, it's very destructive. And, there's historical accounts that go into detail of how this occurred, and it was just very awkward. Apparently they were in, there's a wall separating them when it happened. So it's very disturbing. But yeah, so, this is for all intents and purposes, a demonically possessed individual who was very deep into the magical arts, developed his own system of magic that involved what he believed to be this pre-Hebraic language that Adam used to communicate with God and with the angels. And this is a Kabbalistic notion. In Kabbalah, it's considered kind of derived from the way that Kabbalah was transmitted before it was written and referred to as Kabbalah was through communication with angels. So they believed that these esoteric secrets were communicated to Moses from the angels in this kind of pre-Hebraic language. So he attributes it to an Enochian language. So yeah, kind of to answer your question, this is the guy, all of this is what kind of laid the foundation of the mystical reshaping of the New World. And then of course you have with Francis Bacon, he kind of systematized it and built the ideological infrastructure of how this would be implemented through secret societies and kind of techno-utopianism.
Thank you so much for listening to the free preview of this Aether Hour episode. It's always amazing to have Anthony of Westgate on, so be sure to get behind the paywall, support the show. We talk all about the esoteric Jewish roots of Protestantism, the Kabbalistic roots of the Puritans and, the early Christian settlers of America. We talk about the Great Fire of London, the alchemical transmutation of the world mind via, the printing press technology and this subversive Jewish mythology that has been baked into this post-Orthodox worldview that we have been imbibed in so recently. So be sure to get behind the paywall, support the show. You'll also get access to hundreds and hundreds of hours of other Aether Hour interviews. We're talking interviews with Father Peter Heers, interviews with Abbot Trifon, interviews with Cameron McGregor, Vince James, Rachel Wilson, all sorts of amazing content. And of course, you get the rest of this deep dive with Anthony, as well as multiple other conversations with Anthony. So don't miss out. Be sure to support the show, worldwarnow.co, and we will see you on the other side. God bless.